This week, after those storming local election results for the Labour Party, I'm looking at a lesson from history which contains both enormous reassurance but also a very serious warning for today's Labour Party. Let's begin this week with the local election results. The Conservatives down by 500 councillors or so, and Labour having that by-election win as well. And the Labour leader, avuncular, grey-haired, steely, sure of himself, but criticised by some people for not being radical enough. And yet there's this sense that the Tories have been in power so long, they have now definitively lost their reputation for economic competence after that terrible crisis, and they're tearing themselves apart again over Europe. Now, sharp-eared listeners might have spotted that I was not talking about Keir Starmer and the local elections of 2024 there, but about the late John Smith and the local elections of 1994, which took place just a week before he died suddenly of a heart attack at the age of 55. Now, these days, the comparisons between John Smith, another grey-haired lawyer, towards the centre of the party, and Keir Starmer aren't very much talked about. And that is, I suppose, because John Smith's time as leader of the Labour Party was only a couple of years, so brief, before his death, and so quickly overtaken by the arrival of Tony Blair and the new narrative of New Labour. But there are some really interesting parallels and I think one warning to look at here. Now, in many ways, today's Keir Starmer and yesterday's John Smith, although both grey-haired lawyers, could hardly have been more different. In terms of political personality, John Smith was a waspish, clubbable man who adored the House of Commons. He was convivial, hard drinking. He loved the gossip. He loved the intrigue. He loved all of the big parliamentary debates. And he was a superb, self-certain parliamentary performer at a time when Labour in those days didn't have very many of them.
The oldest trick in Tory politics. Promise one thing, do another. Didn't arrive with pollsters over the last year or two. It's been there. It's got a much longer and more distinguished ancestry than that.
Now, I think Keir Starmer, by contrast, loathes the silly theatricals of Prime Minister's questions and isn't at his best doing it. He is not a natural parliamentarian. He came late into Westminster, and I think he deeply dislikes the clubbiness and the intrigue and the drinking and all of that. But there is also a really important political difference, because John Smith had a long, unbroken political tradition to lean back on, which he was very certain about. And it was the old Labour right-wing tradition of Dennis Healey and Jim Callaghan and later on Roy Hattersley, into which he fitted perfectly. He was a pro-European, big state, high tax, high spending, traditional Labour right-winger. And after New Labour and Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and then the Corbyn episode, I don't think Keir Starmer does have that kind of unbroken, self-certain tradition to lean into himself. So that is a really important distinction between the two men. But in many other ways, the parallels between the two men are uncanny. Both built their reputations and their parties' reputations in part by attacking and exposing previous economic failures by the Conservative Party.
Confronted with the sterling crisis of their own creation, we saw a government gripped by indecision, paralysed by fear, and a Prime Minister plodding on to disaster.
There's only one party that's crashed the economy and they're sitting there.
We don't talk much these days about the sterling crisis of September 1992, the so-called Black Wednesday crisis.
The pound has fallen through its exchange rate floor. The Bank of England has thrown billions of pounds at the currency to try to save it, but in after-hours trading it has fallen still further.
Since then we've had the much bigger financial crisis of 2007, 2008, and of course the Truss moment and much else. And yet at the time it seemed an absolutely huge moment. I can remember being at a Liberal Democrat conference when the news of sterling's collapse from the ERM, the exchange rate mechanism, occurred. And we literally packed our bags and left the hall as Liberal Democrat speakers were on their feet and took the trains back down to London because this seemed an enormous national crisis, a moment of huge humiliation for the Conservatives after the Thatcher and early Major years. A really, really important moment indeed. And John Smith exposed that failure in devastating attacks in the House of Commons day after day.
He is the devalued Prime Minister of a devalued government.
It was a period when Britain had much higher inflation and much, much lower growth, seem familiar, than France and Germany. and there was a sense that Britain's underlying economic weakness was being exposed, as of course it was later on in the later crises. So if you take Black Wednesday and you compare it to the Truss moment recently and look at the way Labour has exploited those two things, and if you also think that back then, after the Maastricht Treaty, there was a really intense Tory leadership feud going on, again exploited very amusingly by John Smith, and you compare that to what's going on in the Conservative Party right now, then you do not need a Dayglow highlighter pen to underline the similarities. Really, really striking.
If we were to offer this tale of events to the BBC Light Entertainment Department as a script for a programme, I think the producers of Westminster would have turned it down as hopelessly over the top. I think it might have even been too much, for some mothers do have them.
And there are cultural parallels too, I think. Like Keir Starmer, John Smith was more than a little contemptuous of what he regarded as metropolitan cultural chic and infantile ultra-leftism, and very much focused on the economic interests of British working-class voters.
All workers will be placed on an equal legal footing, part-time, full-time, temporary or permanent.
And I think you can see the parallel there with Keir Starmer very clearly.
Fundamental rights from day one. Statutory sick pay for all. No more one-sided flexibility and no more fire and rehire.
Like Keir Starmer, he was a great supporter of the trade unions, and although I'll come on to this, he had been a bit of a tax and spender earlier on, by the time he was Labour leader, he was completely convinced that the route to liberating working class people in Britain was economic growth. Let me read you what he said during the 1993 speech to the Trade Union Congress. Labour's economic strategy will ensure that all instruments of macroeconomic management, whether it concerns interest rates, exchange rates or levels of borrowing, will be geared to growth and rising employment. Now, David Ward, who was John Smith's head of policy more or less throughout his period as Shadow Chancellor and then leader of the Labour Party, makes the point that that sounds very, very like the Securonomics of Starmer and Rachel Reeves. And he is dead right. There are strong, strong parallels all the way through.
There is no viable growth strategy today which does not rest upon resilience for our national economy and security for working people.
And by this stage, you might be thinking, OK, fair enough. Here are the obvious parallels. A moderate, centrist, decent, respectable, not terribly exciting Labour leader taking Labour towards power, cut off by a heart attack. It's a sad parallel, but it's not a very complicated one, is it? But there is another aspect to the John Smith parallel, which I think needs to be thought about and is not entirely benign. Like so many of the old Labour right, he was an absolutely instinctive, moral, natural tax and spend man, a man who believed it was virtuous to tax more, who didn't frankly understand Middle England very well and didn't care about that either. And the most obvious example of that is his famous shadow budget of 1992. For those innocent days, it was a moment of extraordinary political theatre because John Smith behaved as if he was already the Chancellor. He had a big, big press conference, the entire national media, all the broadcasters came to it, and he stood in front of us waving these documents which looked like official Treasury documents and laid out Labour's tax and spend plans in some detail. And then he had himself photographed on the steps of the Treasury with the Labour Treasury team, and it was really pushing his economic tanks onto Norman Lamont's lawn. It was a very, very extraordinary moment. But behind all the theatre, there was, as John Major, the Prime Minister at the time, later pointed out, £38 billion worth of extra spending in the document to be paid for, as Major said, by higher taxes for almost everybody.
They mean a whopping tax increase, not just for the rich, certainly for them, but a tax increase for each and every taxpayer.
Well, it wasn't for almost everybody, but it was for a lot of higher earners. All this allowed the Conservatives to commission the very famous Saatchi and Saatchi poster, Labour's Tax Bombshell, which said that every family in the country would be paying £1,250 more in taxes if Labour won the election, which was just about to take place. And of course, Neil Kinnock lost the 1992 election, and lots of people blame John Smith for that. Interestingly, Neil Kinnock himself doesn't.
The heroes of this campaign, wrote Lord McAlpine, were Sir David English, Sir Nicholas Lloyd, Kelvin Mackenzie, and the other editors of the grander Tory press. Never in the past 9 elections have they come out so strongly in favour of the Conservatives.
And it is also true that before John Smith, the Conservatives constantly attacked Labour for wanting to tax and spend more. And after John Smith, the Conservatives constantly attacked Labour for wanting to tax and spend more. So it was part of a pattern. However, I think it's interesting that a lot of the people around Keir Starmer and around the Labour Treasury team today grew up politically during that period. They were young at the time. They do remember the 1992 shadow budget. They do remember very vividly the 1992 general election. And I think a suspicion of tax and spend is ingrained inside them. Now, today, John Smith lies in one of the most beautiful cemeteries anywhere in the United Kingdom, on the so-called Holy Island of Iona off the Scottish west coast, where he is washed by pure water and the scent of thyme and heather and the Atlantic is all around in the air. And I think the message from beyond that grave is mostly very optimistic for Labour here in 2024 after storming local election results, actually much better than they were back in John Smith's day and on the very lip, I think, of taking power again. And the most important message, perhaps, is that those old unfashionable traditional virtues of seriousness, moderation, respect and decency still are absolutely at the core of what the British public wants from their politicians today. I do think John Smith always understood that. I think Keir Starmer understands that. But there is a very, very important coda. Just because they admire those virtues and they admire people who have those qualities, that does not mean that the English electorate in particular wants to vote for higher taxes to pay for them. I find, personally, Rachel Reeves's absolute inflexibility about higher taxation or new ways to raise borrowing really, really frustrating. But then I think back to John Smith and I think back to the 1992 shadow budget. And for all his decency, I suspect perhaps that Rachel Reeves understood something about John Smith I did not back then. And above all, in the end, it's the economy is stupid and all the great parliamentary performances in the world cannot change that.